Hello everybody, I'm Chris, and I'd like to welcome you back to the series I'm doing called Blueprint for Composition. In the previous installments of this series, I spent some time describing and explaining some of the key terms revolving around the correct composition of sentences, and we looked at different sentence components and talked about independent clauses and how clauses and phrases are different and how to distinguish between a clause and a phrase in general. And we also looked at some practice exercises identifying the difference between independent clauses, or what are known as simple sentences, and what the key components of the simple sentence are, or the key components of the independent clause are. And we also looked at how to identify phrases and what distinguishes a phrase from a clause. And we also discussed something known as a sentence fragment. So, in the previous video of this series, we did a practice exercise in which we labeled independent clauses, phrases, and fragments. So I had a list of 5 sentences on the board here, and we talked about each one of those sentences individually and identified those different types of structures: independent clause, phrase, and fragment. So we're going to build off that today, and we're going to focus on things known as compound sentences. So each video of this series is going to be designed to build off and expand on things that we cover in previous installments. So today we're going to build off the ideas contained in the last episode and talk about compound sentences. So let's look at the definition of what a compound sentence is. So we talked about the simple sentence in the previous example of this series, and we said that a simple sentence is composed of one independent clause. It's a subject, has a verb, and it expresses a complete idea. That was the definition of the independent clause, or what is known as the simple sentence. So, obviously that is a very basic and fundamental piece of information that you need to know. But if you were to write an entire paragraph or an entire series of paragraphs that only contain short, simple sentences, that would be very repetitive and very much tedious for a reader to have to wade through. So, we have to build up our level of sophistication in how to express our ideas in writing academic English. So one of the ways that we can do that is through a process known as sentence variety, to vary our different types of sentences as we write paragraphs and essays, for example. So the compound sentence is another method of introducing what is called sentence variety. So the level of sophistication for a compound sentence is slightly higher than that of a simple sentence. So let's go into how it differs from the simple sentence. So the compound sentence is defined as, if we look over here at this part of the board, the compound sentence is defined as 2 or more independent clauses joined by a comma and a conjunction. So these are the essential aspects of the compound sentence. At least 2 independent clauses. So it may have 3 independent clauses. It may have more than 3. But generally speaking, a compound sentence, you don't want to string too many independent clauses together in one sentence because it would be difficult to follow the syntax of that sentence. But in general, you will find compound sentences are usually limited to 2 independent clauses joined by a comma and a conjunction. So if we diagram it this way, you will see independent clause 1 will start with a capital letter, and then you'll have this comma in the middle, and then you'll have some kind of conjunction after the comma, and then you'll have a second independent clause, which will be in actuality a continuation of the thought, and it will have a small letter, not a capital letter, and that will be called independent clause 2. So you have independent clause 1, comma, conjunction, independent clause 2, and then at the end there'll be a period. So that is the construction or the general formula for the compound sentence. So what we have to talk about now are the different types of conjunctions. So what is the purpose of a conjunction? Well, the general purpose of a conjunction is to join ideas together. So it can join clauses together, as you see here, but it can also join words together. And it can join nouns, it can join verbs, it can join adjectives, adverbs. All different types of parts of speech can be joined by a conjunction. So we'll talk about the different ways that conjunctions can be used and how they would form perhaps things called compound verbs and compound subjects. So if you look over here, compound verbs, compound subjects. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail as we go. But first, let's focus on the conjunction as it functions in a compound sentence. So, what are the different types of conjunctions that we use to join clauses together in order to form a compound sentence? Well, if you look over here, I put this acronym on the board, which is not my invention. I cannot take credit for this, but it is commonly known as a way to remember the different types of conjunction. It is called the fanboys acronym, or it is known by the acronym fanboys. So, I'm going to fill in the rest of the conjunctions here as we go. I used 2 examples already with the conjunction and the conjunction but. And again, these are common conjunctions, and you will see them in compound sentences most likely. There are other conjunctions, however, that can be used to join clauses. So let's fill them in. So the F is for, N is for nor, O is for or, Y is for yet, and S is for so. So these are the most common words that we use as conjunctions. And again, this is a commonly known acronym for remembering these conjunctions. Now you might think, why do we have so many different conjunctions? Because what we are doing here is we are linking ideas. And I want to stress the importance of that fact. We are linking ideas, joining ideas together. So a conjunction has a purpose to join ideas together, join clauses, join words, join phrases. That is the purpose of a conjunction. The conjunction is technically not designed to separate ideas. And this is a very important point, because a lot of people will start sentences with conjunctions. And technically speaking, it is not proper to start a sentence with a conjunction, because you're putting a capital letter on that conjunction and you're saying that's the start of a new sentence. Well, a conjunction, in reality, its purpose is to join ideas, not to separate them. So, there are different types of conjunctions, but we'll get into other types of conjunctions later, things known as subordinating conjunctions, and adverbial conjunctions, this kind of thing, we'll talk about later. But for today, let's just focus on these kind of conjunctions that are joining 2 independent clauses, or in the form of a compound subject, compound verb. So, let's look at how they work. So, for, and, nor, but, or, yet, or so. These all have different functions depending on the kind of relationship that you're trying to express between the 2 independent clauses that you are joining here together. So, the use of the word for would introduce an explanation. The use of the word and is primarily to add extra information. Nor is a sort of situation where you're trying to express something of a negative relationship between the 2 parts of the clauses. But is used to show contrast. All right? One thing in opposition to another. The word or indicates a choice. You have an option or an alternative that you're trying to show as a relationship between these 2 clauses. The use of the word yet is similar to the use of the word but. It shows opposition or contrast. A lot of times, yet will be used in more academic types of writing, as opposed to but, which is more commonly used in day-to-day communications, for example. And then the word so, the last word so, on the list here, that indicates a cause and effect relationship. So if you're trying to express how one thing is a cause and one thing is an effect, through the use of this compound sentence, you would use the word so to indicate the effect or the outcome or the consequence of the first action that is expressed in independent clause 1. So these are the different types of conjunctions. I'm not going to illustrate them all with a particular sentence, but just for an example, we have a sentence here using the word and a sentence here using the word but, just to illustrate how these 2 sentences are joined together. So the first sentence here, the first independent clause here, I went swimming, comma, and I went for a walk along the shore. So this is independent clause 1. And here's your conjunction. And then this, I went for a walk along the shore. This is independent clause 2. Okay? So the word and is just adding information or giving more detail about the whole experience of this particular person who went somewhere and did something. So we're just describing this person's sort of experience. I went swimming, number one, and I went for a walk along the shore. It also indicates a time order here, a sequence of events. What happened first, what happened second. So what the person is basically saying is that they went swimming first, and then they went for a walk along the shore at some point later in the day, perhaps. Second example. They wanted to go, but they didn't have enough time. So again, independent clause 1, conjunction after the comma. So this comma, again, I have to stress, the comma is important because the comma is also showing this connection between the two ideas. The comma is joining these two ideas together along with the conjunction. So a lot of people will leave out that comma, but it is in fact necessary if you're talking about a compound sentence here. So they wanted to go comma, but they didn't have enough time. Here's independent clause 2. So it follows the same pattern, the same formula. They wanted to go, that's the first idea, but, so I mentioned a few moments ago that the word but shows contrast or opposition. So they had an idea to go somewhere, but, and this introduces the opposition, they didn't have enough time. So what follows that but is generally going to be a negative verb, because it's showing an opposition to this affirmative verb, want. So they wanted to do something, but something prevented them from doing that. In this case, the fact that they did not have enough time to do that thing. All right? So this is the whole formula for introducing two ideas into one sentence with the conjunction in the middle. And again, don't forget the comma. The whole purpose of showing it this way is to remind people the comma and the conjunction are necessary if you have an independent clause and another independent clause on the other side of the conjunction. Because one of the rules about joining words together is that whatever's on the left side of the conjunction must be equal in terms of what is on the right side. So if there is not any equality between these two sides on opposite sides of the conjunction, you have what is called faulty parallel structure. And parallel structure is something which is tested frequently on these standardized tests. So we'll talk about parallel structure in more detail at another time. But sometimes people get confused. Well, if I see a conjunction in a sentence, does that mean that it's automatically a compound sentence? And the answer is no. A compound sentence has to follow this particular arrangement. Independent clause 1, comma, and conjunction. After that conjunction, you have independent clause number 2. That's the formula. That's the arrangement for the compound sentence. So every sentence that has a conjunction in it does not automatically qualify as a compound sentence. You really have to look at the overall construction of the sentence. For instance, there are such things known as compound subjects. All right, so let's look down here for a moment. Compound subjects. And there are also things known as compound verbs. So these are actually very common in writing. When you are joining ideas together or when you are joining parts of speech together, whether it's a noun, a verb, a pronoun, an adjective, an adverb, you can still make use of conjunctions. So I will illustrate this point with the sentence that I wrote down here and describe how it is, in fact, not a compound sentence even though it uses conjunctions. So in this particular example down here, it says, Jack and Susan traveled to Hawaii, went snorkeling, and bought a lot of seafood. All right, so here we see a couple of different conjunctions in the sentence. We see the conjunction and here, and we also see it over here. So there are two conjunctions here. But what are the two conjunctions doing? What is their function in the sentence? The two conjunctions in this case are actually joining two nouns, Jack and Susan. So in our previous installments, we talked about how these conjunctions and subjects will appear at the beginning of a sentence 9 times out of 10 if the sentence is a statement. So again, we're looking at statements here. We're not looking at questions or other kinds of word arrangements at this time. So what we want to focus on when I said the first step is to identify a subject, we have to look at number 1, is there more than one subject? So some sentences, as is the case here, can have more than one subject. In fact, this one has 2, Jack and Susan. So if I'm going to use 2 subjects, I have to join those 2 words together with a conjunction. In this case, I'm just using the conjunction and to show addition. So Jack plus Susan, basically. Jack and Susan. So two people. Right? So I identify that as my compound subject. Now, what about the compound verb? I just mentioned a moment ago, when you do 1, 2, 3 things and join them together, you need to join them with conjunctions. So, how is it working here? In previous installments, I said, always identify the subjects and the verbs, because that's what the whole sentence revolves around, are the subjects and the verbs. Whatever else is in the sentence, beyond the subject and verb, these are just things that you put in for extra detail, extra information, to give the reader a better idea, a better understanding of the whole idea that you're trying to convey to the reader. So therefore, we look at the sentence here, we see Jack and Susan, and I mentioned in the previous video, where you're going to look in a sentence for a verb, it's after the subject. So here's our first verb, is the verb traveled. Now, we do have other verbs in the sentence, so we have to identify those verbs as well. So I have the word traveled, which is here. I also have the verb went over here, and I also have the word bought over here. And you will notice there is a comma right here. And the reason for that comma is because I'm using 3 verbs in this case. I'm not just using 2. You notice here where I put Jack and Susan, I don't need a comma there because I'm not listing more than 2 people. If I was listing more than 2 people, I would need to put a comma in between each one of the series. But since Jack and Susan are 2 people, I can just join that with a comma, with a conjunction rather, and no comma. In this case, I have 3 verbs. I have traveled, I have went, and I have the word bought. So not only is there a comma there, there's also a comma here, because I have to separate these items in this series by using these commas. So in this case, 3 verbs: traveled, went, and bought. So that's the purpose of this conjunction here, is the word and is adding additional information, because and is used to add information or add additional detail. So this is what is known as a compound verb: traveled, went, and bought. So, question. I said, I went swimming and I went for a walk along the shore. That's a compound sentence. They wanted to go, comma, but they didn't have enough time. That's a compound sentence. So my question is this. Jack and Susan traveled to Hawaii, went snorkeling, and bought a lot of seafood. Does this qualify as a compound sentence? Think about that for a moment. Yes, it does, or no, it doesn't. Jack and Susan traveled to Hawaii, went snorkeling, and bought a lot of seafood. Is this a compound sentence? The answer is no, it is not. Because why? Does it follow the same arrangement as the compound sentence requirements? Does it have 2 independent clauses joined by a comma and a conjunction? In this case, it does not. It has a compound subject, yes. It has compound verbs, yes. But that does not make it a compound sentence. This, in fact, this whole thing, even though it looks like a long sentence, it is, in fact, a simple sentence. Because, again, what did I say was the definition of a simple sentence? At least one subject and one verb, and expresses a complete idea. So Jack and Susan is a compound subject. Went, traveled, went, and bought. Verbs, true, but there's only one clause here. This is all one independent clause. So therefore, not a compound sentence. It is a simple sentence. So you really have to be careful. This is going back to the original point. Just because I see conjunctions in a sentence here and here doesn't automatically qualify it as a compound sentence. All right? So you really have to examine the sentence carefully, find the subjects, find the verbs, and look at the arrangement of the words in the sentence and compare. Does it qualify as a compound sentence? Does it have one independent clause, a comma, a conjunction, and then a second independent clause? In this case, we don't have that. We only have one independent clause. So therefore, simple sentence. So do not get confused by sentences that have conjunctions in them and say, okay, I see a conjunction there, I see a conjunction there, I see a comma here. Well, those commas may be there for a different reason. And this is the point. You really have to analyze each sentence carefully particularly on the standardized tests that we discussed at length in previous videos in this series. So, that's about all for now. When we get into the next topic, we'll do some practice as to how to distinguish, with more specific examples, the simple sentence versus the compound sentence. So, I would like to thank you for watching, and I hope this was helpful as an introduction to compound sentences. And then the next video we'll get into some sample exercises to help you solidify your knowledge of the difference between simple sentences and compound sentences. So thank you for watching. We'll see you again real soon.